Now we're going to start working some genetics problems using Punnett squares. We're going to start with single traits. Let's look at hairline characteristics first. The dominant allele of widow's peak, we could assign a large W to represent its dominance. The recessive allele is that of a straight hairline. So in the case of hairline, if we take a look here, looking at hairline, a widow's peak is the dominant trait, whereas a straight hairline is the recessive trait. In the case of a single trait, there are three possible combinations of these two alleles. Here's our two alleles, a capital W for the dominant, lowercase w for the recessive. So you could either have two large W's, one of each. You could have a large W, little w, or two little w's. If you have two alleles that are the same, that individual is said to be homozygous. Homo means same. If the two alleles are different, then the individual is said to be heterozygous, since hetero means different. So if we're looking at that, you can have an individual who is homozygous dominant, being big W, or they could be heterozygous, big W, little w, or homozygous recessive. With genetics problems, even though we could have little w, big W, we usually switch those around so that it's big W, little w instead. That way we don't get confused. If the genotype is homozygous dominant, that's two big W's, then the phenotype, remember this is the physical characteristic, will be widow's peak. So now we get to review that concept of genotype versus phenotype. So the genotype, we have two ways that we can describe that here. If we're looking at a widow's peak, you could have genotype as either homozygous dominant, shown here. You could write that out, or you could put the alleles here, the big W, big W. You could also have big W, little w, which is heterozygous, which is also widow's peak. Notice here that there are two different genotypes that have the same phenotype. This is because of that concept of dominance versus recessiveness. So the only way in these simple genetics problems to have a recessive trait, which is the straight hairline here, is to have the homozygous recessive genotype. That's little w, so two recessive alleles. The genotype has two alleles for each trait, whereas a gamete has one allele for each trait. This is looking at that concept again of kind of diploid versus haploid whenever we looked at cell division. Reviewing also, Mendel's law of segregation states that during meiosis, homologous chromosomes separate so that only one member of each pair is in a gamete. Therefore, only one allele exists for each trait in a haploid gamete. Remembering again that haploid just means you have one copy of that chromosome, and on that chromosome there's genes, and we're representing those genes or those traits by alleles. When we're solving genetics problems, no two letters in a gamete can be the same letter of the alphabet. If the genotype is big W, little w, then gametes for this individual will contain either a big W or a little w. We'll see several examples of this. A sample cross. If you have a homozygous man with a widow's peak who reproduces with a woman with straight hair, this is the cross we get. So here we were just told that widow's peak is the dominant trait. The information here is that the man is homozygous. If he has a widow's peak, he's going to be homozygous dominant. That's represented here by this big W, big W. The woman with straight hair, since that is a recessive trait, we know immediately what the genotype is. That's going to be little w, little w. looking at the man here, no matter how the gametes are formed, he can only give the dominant allele seen here. Likewise, for the woman, no matter how gametes are formed in this case, she can only pass on the recessive allele seen here. Whenever that egg is fertilized by the sperm, then the resulting zygote is going to have the diploid number restored and have 2 alleles for that trait. This represents the alleles for any potential offspring as big W, little w. So, does this represent a homozygous or heterozygous individual? It should be heterozygous. And so heterozygous would be genotype, also represented by our alleles or the letters here, and the phenotype is widow's peak. When we're solving simple genetics problems, here's a good list of steps to follow. First, determine the genotype of each parent. Second, list possible gametes from each parent. 3, combine all possible gametes. And 4, determine the genotypes and phenotypes of all offspring. If we're solving a cross when 2 individuals are both heterozygous, or big W, little w, as seen here with hairline, this is called a monohybrid cross. Mono means one. Hybrid is one of each. This is why you see the big W, little w. Here's where we see our first Punnett square. In a Punnett square, seen here, the alleles of the parents are placed on the tops and along the sides. So they're representing the male's gametes here and the female's gametes here. And so through meiosis, when gametes are produced, whenever these are broken apart from a diploid cell to a haploid cell that's produced in meiosis, both of these parents have the same genotype. So we're going to see the same genotype on the sides here. The female's dominant allele represented here. If we drop that down there, and here, bringing across the male's dominant allele here. So that's where we're getting this big W in this first square. This represents a potential cross. And so similarly, we would fill in this here. This one comes down here. Here, while we could write little w, big W here, it's more helpful to write it out as the big W, little w, then we see the dominant trait that's there. So that's why we're dropping things down like that. Similarly, to fill in this last square, we have a homozygous recessive individual represented there. So this is already color-coded as to phenotype, since to have a widow's peak, we need at least one dominant allele. So we see that here, we see that here, and we see that here. So these 3 out of 4 squares here represent offspring with widow's peak. That's what they're talking about with this phenotypic ratio here. The final square here represents a homozygous recessive individual that would have a straight hairline. Besides doing the phenotypic ratio, we can also do the genotypic ratio. So after determining genotype and phenotypes of offspring from the Punnett square, we can perform this tally. The genotypic ratio is we have 1 homozygous dominant to 2 heterozygous to 1 homozygous recessive. This is a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. The phenotypic ratio, as we just saw, was 3 to 1, as in 3 widow's peak to 1 straight hairline. And again, the 3 individuals have a widow's peak because they carry at least 1 dominant allele. We could also use probability to figure out these problems. The chance of 2 or more independent events occurring together is the product of their chance of occurring separately. This is the product rule of probability. So that same cross, we have 2 heterozygous parents what is the chance of obtaining either a big W, that's the dominant allele, or a little w, that's the recessive allele from a parent? So we're just looking at one parent at a time. So if we're looking at this, it's like flipping a coin. The chance of getting this big W, you have a 1 out of 2 chance. And likewise, the chance of obtaining this little w, or the recessive allele, is also 1 out of 2. Once we have that figured out, we can have the probability of having genotypes. So the chance of having big W, you have 1 out of 2 multiplied by 1 out of 2 equals 1 out of 4. That's a 25% chance. The chance of getting big W, little w is the same. 1 out of 2 times 1 out of 2, 1 out of 4, or 25%. The chance of getting little w, big W is also going to be a quarter chance, or 25%. And the chance of getting little w is also 25%. So we get the same result using this product rule of probability as we did with the Punnett square right here. If we're also looking at probability, we can use the sum rule of probability. This states that the chance of an event can occur in more than one way is the sum of the individual chances. So to calculate the chance of offspring having widow's peak, you add the chances of big W, big W, big W, little w, or little w, big W, or little w, little w. So the chance of widow's peak, we would take that has a widow's peak, this one has a widow's peak, also this one, since we have that dominant allele. We figured out that for all of those, we had a 1 out of 4 chance. So if we add that up here, we get a 3 out of 4, or 75% chance. 3 out of 4 total possibilities. The chance of a straight hairline here was just a 1 out of 4 possibility. So we can see that we get the same result using probability or a Punnett square. We just looked at widow's peak versus straight hairline. Another human characteristic is having freckles or not having freckles. Having freckles is dominant. So in order to have freckles seen here, we could have either homozygous dominant or heterozygous as the genotype. This shows a monohybrid cross between parents that have freckles. As you can see, it's very similar to the cross that we worked for hairline. Sometimes we're given information as to the genotypes of the parents, and other times we're not. We can't determine by observation alone if an individual who is expressing the dominant trait is homozygous or heterozygous, right? Because in order to have the dominant trait, you could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. A test cross is designed to determine that genotype since it's unknown. In a test cross, an organism with the dominant phenotype is crossed with the recessive individual. This is because the recessive individual has a known genotype. If there are offspring produced with the recessive phenotype, then the dominant parent must be heterozygous. Let's look. If the parent was homozygous dominant and was crossed with a homozygous recessive individual, then if we work out a Punnett square here, all of the offspring should have the dominant phenotype. So here, this is represented by all having widow's peaks. On the other hand, if the parent with the dominant phenotype having a widow's peak was recessive and was crossed with the recessive phenotype, then there would be a 50-50 chance of having offspring with either phenotype. As we can see here, these offspring would have a widow's peak, and these down here would have a straight hairline. You can compare these side by side. We could also compare this with freckles. So the same concept applies. If we had a homozygous dominant parent then all offspring would be heterozygous, shown here. Or if a parent was heterozygous, that's showing the dominant phenotype having freckles and is crossed with the recessive phenotype here, no freckles, then there's a 2 out of 4 chance, or 50% chance, of having freckles, or 50% chance of not having freckles. Let's try some practice problems. Both a man and woman are heterozygous for freckles. Freckles are dominant over no freckles. What is the chance their child will have freckles? So first, we have to figure out what information is given. So the parents are heterozygous. Hetero means different. So this means that both parents are going to be heterozygous, have big F, little f. So if we use a Punnett square to work this, we can have one parent here, and the other parent here. So to work this, we're dropping down these alleles. So this one comes here. So does this potential child here represent having freckles or not? A big F is homozygous dominant, which would have freckles. Okay, so working this next square, so bringing over dominant, dropping down the recessive allele, and here dominant, recessive, and this last square we have 2 recessive alleles. So if we're looking here, this child would have freckles. What about this one? Would it have half freckles and half not freckles? No, because in a diploid organism, you're going to have 2 alleles for each trait, right? So we have a big F and a little f. With simple dominance, one dominant allele is all that's needed for that trait to be expressed. So this child has freckles, it's just heterozygous. And same here. So we have 3 out of 4 that have freckles. This one here, we have 1 out of 4 that don't have freckles. We want these two to add up to 1. So 3 out of 4 plus 1 out of 4 will equal 4 out of 4, or 1. Let's check. All right, 75%, or 3 out of 4. We got that one right. Our next practice problem. Both you and your sister or brother have attached earlobes, but your parents have unattached earlobes. Unattached earlobes are dominant over attached earlobes. What are the genotypes of your parents? Okay, so we have to see what's given. So unattached earlobes, represented by this big E, are going to be dominant. So to have unattached earlobes, we could have homozygous dominant or heterozygous. But to have attached, which is recessive, we can only have little e, little e. Okay, so we have siblings, both you and your brother or sister, that have attached earlobes. So that means that your genotype is going to be little e, little e. But the parents have unattached, so they could be either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So we could work out Punnett squares, combining parents either that have homozygous dominant, maybe one of them does and one of them is heterozygous, or we could try them as both being homozygous dominant, or we could try them both being heterozygous. So you could work out Punnett squares for each of those. You could also look logically that in order to have children that have the recessive allele, and because each parent must pass off an allele, they can't have this one, right? Because if they did, that child would always get a dominant allele, right? So that one doesn't work. So let's test this out with a Punnett square. If we have one parent that is heterozygous, the other one that is heterozygous, and make our square and fill this out. Okay, we're looking for the chance they're going to have any offspring with unattached earlobes. And it's possible, right? There's only a 25% chance of it happening, but that's possible. Another way to show your work on a problem like this is if you had the parents represented here and you want to have your offspring represented here, you could show that these alleles can come together to produce offspring with the recessive genotype and phenotype. We'll check ourselves here too. The mother and the father both have heterozygous genotypes. Let's look at another practice problem. The father has dimples, the mother of his children does not, and all 5 of their children have dimples. Dimples, capital D, are dominant over no dimples, lowercase d. Give the probable genotypes of all persons concerned. Okay, so we know that dimples are dominant. So in order to have dimples, we could be either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. No dimples, the recessive trait, we only have one genotype possible for that, is little d, little d. This already tells us the genotype of the mother. If the mother does not have dimples, she's going to be little d, little d. So we'll start what we know. The father could be either heterozygous or homozygous dominant. The mother, the only way to not have dimples is to be homozygous recessive. The children, this is very similar to a test cross because this is giving you the results of a cross, right? Since we know that to have dimples, we don't know for certain whether the father is heterozygous or homozygous dominant. But having 5 children who all have dimples gives us a pretty big clue. Because the children, again, in order to have dimples, theoretically, they could have either heterozygous or homozygous dominant genotypes. However, we know that they had to receive the recessive allele from the mother. So this lets us know all 5 of these children, in order to have dimples, they must have the dominant allele. However, they must receive the recessive allele from their mother. So we have 2 options here. Option number 1 is that the father is heterozygous. The mother we know is homozygous recessive. So if the father is heterozygous, we have 1 of each. And filling out this Punnett square, we see, okay, so that's dimples. This is no dimples. So if the father is heterozygous, this is representing the father on this side, then there would be a 50-50 chance, 2 out of 4, compared to 2 out of 4, that the children would either have dimples or not. So that's one option, but since you have 5 children that all have dimples, if we worked our other option, if the father is homozygous dominant, this is going to give us these results. In this case, we have all represented as having dimples, right? So we have 4 out of 4, or a 100% chance of having dimples. This seems a little more likely or probable. All right, so in order to give the final answer to this problem, we need to look at what was asked. Give the probable genotypes of all persons concerned. So we have the father, which is most likely going to be homozygous dominant. The mother, we figured that out. She was the easiest one, right? Homozygous recessive. And all 5 children are going to be heterozygous. So here's our final answer. Let's check that. Father, homozygous dominant. Mother, homozygous recessive. Children, heterozygous.